Welcome, everyone.
Yeah.
It's great to see so many of you here.
No, it's okay.
I'm Patricia Rosenmeyer. I'm the faculty director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Heilig Lecture. The Morris Ida and Allen Heilig Lectureship Fund was made possible in 2004 by a very generous gift from Allen Heilig, class of 53, and Deborah Heilig Schwartz in honor of their parents. Deborah later added her brother's name in recognition of his interests in the field of Jewish studies. And this fund, for over 20 years, has allowed the center to bring to Carolina a distinguished speaker to discuss Jewish history and the Jewish experience. And so we're very grateful to the Schwartz and Heilig families for their support. The Heilig Lecture tonight will be delivered by Alon Tal. Professor Alon Tal's career has been a balance between academia and public interest advocacy. Between 2021 and 2022, he was a member of the Knesset, Israel's parliament, where he served as chair of the subcommittee for environmental and climate impact on health. Currently, he has an appointment as professor in the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University, but he's held faculty posts all over: Stanford, Harvard, Ben Gurion, Hebrew University, Michigan State, and my favorite, Otago University in New Zealand. He's also founded several Israeli environmental organizations, including the Israel Union for Environmental Defense and the Arava Institute. But most importantly for some in the room, perhaps, Alon Tal is a former Tar Heel, a UNC Chapel Hill alumnus, class of 1980. Dr. Tal's lecture will review past environmental cooperation initiatives in the Middle East. Because of its modest size, Israel's environmental problems are largely transboundary. Without cooperation with its neighbors, progress in areas from stream restoration to species repatriation will be modest at best. And so ideally, the peace process can be leveraged to ensure future ecological dividends for the region, which so desperately needs them. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored, thank you very much, by the Department of Earth, Marine, and Environmental Science, the Environment, Ecology, Energy Program, the Department of American Studies, and the UNC Institute for the Environment. And I think we have a lot of environmental studies students here, so I'm delighted. I want to remind you, undergrads, to get CLE credit, and sign up either on the door or on your phones. We'd also like to thank Campus Hillel for organizing a student-focused dinner last night. So as is our custom, the lecture will be followed by a Q&A period to, as they say, entertain questions from the audience. I'd ask you to be courteous and respectful towards the speaker if you choose to speak, and I'm going to come around with the microphone so everyone can hear your questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tal to speak on Will the Environment Survive a Renewed Middle East Peace Process?
Good evening. How are we doing with the acoustics? Everybody can hear me? Thank you all so much for coming out this evening, especially for the environmental studies major. Unfortunately, when I came to UNC in 1978, there was no environmental studies program, and I've been playing catch up ever since, but you guys get the head start with Carolina's storied and really internationally venerated environmental studies program. So I want to first of all acknowledge this event as being hosted by the Jewish Studies Department at UNC. And when I was an undergrad here, I took, I think, 5 courses in what was at the time an extremely incipient in Jewish Studies program, but with really tremendous faculty that have enriched my life then and have informed my life ever since. Some of the old timers may remember people like David Halpern, Jack Sasson, Joel Schwartz. These were remarkable educators, and I am very, very grateful for them. I'm so glad the program has blossomed and grown. I want to thank Karen, who was tremendous from the center in setting up all the logistics, and Patricia, who's been a just tremendously warm hostess and maybe a new friend and colleague now. So, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with sort of a personal introduction to the topic before I get into the nitty-gritty. My interest and interaction with the Middle Eastern environmental community really started in 1993. This was the sort of heady days of what is now referred to as the Oslo process, when for the first time, Arab countries beyond Egypt acknowledged, at least Jordan and the Palestinians, an ability to negotiate with Israel, maybe to sort of some sort of a peace agreement. And people were extremely hopeful that this would be a new opportunity for the state of Israel to live in harmony with its neighbors. And so in 1993, a conference was convened in Sfax, Tunisia. Sfax is the second largest city in Tunisia. And it brought together environmental leaders from non-government organizations in about 14 different countries. Everybody from Algeria to Syria and the conference was convened, and I know this maybe the students may not be aware, but there used to be an agency in the United States called USAID, which did wonderful work in terms of helping the world. We hope one day it'll reemerge and continue to do its good work. But at the time, one of the things they decided to do was have this conference. And so they came to the organizers in Tunisia and said, we think because of all this negotiations, which is leading to a peace process starting in Oslo, that we should have an Israeli delegation. And the Tunisians were not enthusiastic. Even today, they don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. As luck would have it, the project manager for USAID was a gentleman by the name of Avram Ben David. He saw this as his personal opportunity to make peace in the Middle East. He said, well, that's really unfortunate, because if you don't accept the Israeli delegation, I'm going to pull the funding on this project. So very quietly and sheepishly, they took an Israeli delegation, and I was, at the time, a young, aggressive public interest environmental advocate suing polluters. I had a lot more hair there and a lot fewer stories to tell, but I was the head of that delegation. And I remember arriving there in Sfax and meeting for the first time for me Arab environmentalists. And they were, of course, extremely curious about us, and I was also about them. And after the initial awkwardness, we kind of got along and we found things interesting. I remember I gave a lecture then about a campaign that we had been part of to stop the discharge of animal waste residues from the Golan Heights dairies, which were threatening water quality in the Sea of Galilee and the Kinneret Lake. And it had been a highly successful campaign, so I brought it into a workshop. And my new Arab environmental colleagues couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that here was a public interest nonprofit organization that was suing the government, having mass demonstrations, lobbying the Knesset, trying to change legislation because the tools in their toolbox were far, far less and more minimal than we had. And even today, none of these countries are really democracies, if we're going to be honest. But it was really a great experience. And when I returned, I had this notion, well, we should be doing more. And I started at the time trying to think about creating a regional organization. We had a former volunteer who came to work with us by the name of Gideon Bromberg. He set up a wonderful organization called EcoPeace, and you'll see some examples of their work, which turned into a regional organization. And then a year or so later, I was living on a kibbutz, a socialist intentional community down south, and they said, you're sure having a good time up there in Tel Aviv, flying up and suing polluters, but we need you down here to do something which will be entrepreneurial, because agriculture needs to be diversified. So after rejecting my wonderful idea of creating a horseback riding program for the park down there, they loved the idea of creating a regional institute which would bring Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians and Egyptians at the time together, along with their international students, to think about the environment. Because when you think about it, the environment in Israel is really no bigger than a postage stamp ecologically. I mean, it's very, very difficult to make progress on a lot of issues unless we coordinate. So we brought, astonishingly, if you build it, they will come, and they did come from Jordan and Palestine, and we were delighted. Also, we had Egyptian students. And very soon, once they sort of parked their biases and prejudices on all sides and just sat in the classroom together, they realized that they kind of wanted the same things: clean air, they wanted to preserve biodiversity, they wanted to have more peace in the region. And it was just an extraordinary adventure to watch these young, idealistic young people defy the conventional wisdom and realize that they do have much more in common than divides them. And that was a really, really exciting experience. So This is the trip to Tunisia was, I think the high point was we snuck away from the conference to go to Jerba, which is an island which has what they claim is the oldest synagogue in the world, with a door that came from Solomon's temple. So if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. But all the same, it was it's something that I take with me. This notion that there are real partners and people with whom I can work. And since that time, and it's, I dare say, really been about 30 years, I have many dear friends and colleagues in the Arab world with whom I've worked, and particularly Palestinians. But that's why October 7th was such a traumatic moment for a lot of us in the sort of peace camp. And I'm on the greed side of that, but where we had not anticipated this kind of I don't know what you call it, the anger and hatred and the brutality that we faced. But what I want to do today is not let that event define us, although I'll maybe say a word or two about some of the challenges now we have in Gaza, but to realize that, you know, to be an environmentalist, you have to be an incurable, ridiculously optimistic person, because the data are so discouraging. There's no reason to get out of bed anywhere in the world. And so I'm going to try to talk about why I think actually the environment is a gateway to a better future in our region. And so I'm going to talk about three issues: water resources, and secondly, the issue of climate change, and finally, biodiversity, if we have time. I think I'll talk about 40 minutes. Is that good? And so let's talk about water, okay? Because that is, when you think about the region of the Middle East, we all know that it's sort of a semi-arid, arid land with water scarcity. So because this is a, you know, I guess we have the captive audience of the environmental studies, I'll sort of direct the next few slides to them. There's a classic debate in natural resources. Is water a source of conflict or cooperation in conditions of scarcity, okay? And there are many very smart people who kind of say, no, water is a source of conflict. For many years, there was a head of the United Nations from Egypt, Boutros Ghali, and he was always almost like a mantra saying, the next wars of the 21st century will all be about water. Empirically, not true. This is a picture of my friend, Aaron Wolf, from the University, Oregon State University. And when he wrote his doctorate up, he made a giant database of all the transboundary watersheds in the world. And he went back in history saying, when were there wars about this? And his 286, okay, this goes back a ways. And his conclusion was, no, water doesn't lead to full-scale wars. It does, when there's shortages, can be a source of tension. And we know that in our own region. In 1966, when Syria tried to divert the sources of the Jordan River, Israel bombed some of their bulldozers, but it didn't lead to full-out blown war. That happened only a year later in the 1967 war. So according to Aaron, in all of history, there's only been one real to fight to the finish war about war, and that was 4,500 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. And since that time, so we could be hopeful, at least if we let the past be any indication, that I think this was the best Google image I could get for that war. But it is perhaps representative of a broader debate in natural resources, which is, should we be optimistic about whether or not we're going to run out of resources or not? Because if we run out, then that could really be a source of conflict. And there is a sort of school of thought, you could say it's cornucopian or Promethean. Prometheus, the Greek god who brought human beings fire, and therefore he paid a terrible price with the ravens eating out his liver. But he is representative of sort of the human technological ability to overcome any problem, okay? And that's a school of thought that thinks that we are not going to be faced by shortage because we have innovation, ingenuity on our side. And they would say on the water issue that water is not finite anymore. We know how to make water, and therefore we can solve the problem of scarcity without any problem at all. If we can just get the institutions right and we can get the technologies right, we can really see that collaboration and cooperation, that's going to be the norm, okay? The opposite side of the perspective is what I would say is the neo-Malthusians. Thomas Malthus, one of my favorite economists, he was not really an economist. He was a preacher in England, but he had a lot of time in the evening because there was no television then. So he read a lot of books, and he wrote something called a theory of population. But his notion was that there's going to be inevitable scarcity because populations are growing faster than the natural resources, and there's going to be gaps. And people who are neo-Malthusian, who are pessimistic today, say, look, here's the real reality. Freshwater shortages are getting worse and worse everywhere you look on the planet. Demand is growing geometrically. Shortages are going to exacerbate existing tensions, and therefore, as time goes on, there's more and more shortages, we're going to see that it's going to be conflict instead of that. So now, rather than sort of blow off that position, I'm going to give you a few examples why we might be concerned and why these people argue it. So this is a picture of the Aral Sea. Used to be, I think, the second largest lake in the Soviet Union, but they had this brilliant idea to irrigate for cotton, and they diverted the water sources, and so it began to shrink and shrink and shrink. And even before he became vice president, this was a opening chapter in Al Gore's book, The Earth and the Balance, where he showed these sort of areas. It used to be a very rich fishery with beautiful lake, and now is a toxic desert because the sands in the area are airborne, and they have all kinds of bad minerals in there, and this is what it looks like, okay? So that's sort of exhibit A in that argument for the mountains. And the other one might be Lake Chad. I was amazed by this thing because it's 25,000 square kilometers, larger than the entire state of Israel, okay? And it was, I think, the third largest rate in Africa, but today it's less than a tenth of its original size, and you can just sort of see it gone, okay? But you could argue, okay, Alon, you are creating a straw man, bringing me examples from the Soviet Union or the paragon of mismanagement, or from, basically failed states in Africa. That's how you're going to prove this? Give me a real example. I said, okay, here was an example. How about the Ogallala Aquifer? When I was in graduate school at the Kennedy School, I had a professor who was always saying, every year, the Ogallala Aquifer, the largest groundwater system in the U.S., heading from North Texas all the way up to the Dakotas, every year it drops about 6 to 10 inches. And eventually, the water's going to get so low, it's not going to be economic to extract it anymore. And I remembered it for the exam and forgot about it promptly thereafter. But years later, I was invited to speak at Texas Tech University. And Texas Tech University is in Lubbock, Texas, the southernmost point of the Ogallala Aquifer. So when they arrived, and they were very, just like Patricia, they welcomed me. They said, what do you want to see? And I didn't say, I want to walk on Franklin Street. I said, I want to see what happened with the Ogallala Aquifer, because this is the agriculture that I had heard was existing up that area. But for that, we had to go see the statue of Buddy Holly, because if you're going to Lubbock, Texas, and then if you are a fan of the former Dixie Chicks, the Chicks, Natalie Maines also wrote a song about the statue. She's from Lubbock, Texas. But after we did that local stuff, he said, oh, last year was the first year they had to stop pumping. And this is what we've got there, okay? So this is the United States of America, the most important aquifer, and it is being depleted, and a exhibit C for the neo-Malthusians. And you can go around and look at Lake Mead and what's happening in there, and the Colorado River, and the list goes on and on and on. So before we start trying to resolve this debate, a good question would be, well, how much water do people actually need, okay? And this is a question which was posed to the late Swedish hydrologist Malin Falkenmark. And the United Nations put her head of a committee, and then she sat there and she gave some very round numbers, which should make you know immediately that they kind of made them up a little bit. But basically, they said people need at least 1,700 cubic meters. And I'll be talking about cubic meters. So for those of you who are, a little bit challenged in the area of the metric system, a cubic meter is 1,000 quarts of water, more or less, okay? So that's 1,700,000 quarts of water a year. That's what people need, according to her. And that's for their food and otherwise. And if they get below that, they're starting to feel stress. And if they go below 1,000, then they're already facing real scarcity, okay? And that's what she said. And you can look at the map there, and you can see that these areas, oh, and look where it's most stressed. Well, that would be my neighborhood, okay? So there is a real issue of stress there. And you can see within, if we drill down into the Middle East, you can see this gives an indication there are some countries that have plenty of resources, like Syria actually has a fair amount of water. Lebanon has much more. That's a surplus of 67% if you look at that. But a country like Jordan, 151%, they are using more water every year than is naturally replenished, okay? Now, how do you do that? Well, you mine. You mine the groundwater, take it out, and assume that there'll be enough down the road. But at some point, just like the Ogallala Aquifer, where they mine water, the bill's gonna come. And that's sort of what's been happening in Jordan in recent years. I mean, Jordan is the regional champion in absorption of refugees. They took a lot of Palestinians in 1948, 1 million Iraqis, some people say 2 million Syrians, but they have a lot of people came in. So their population has grown from about 500,000 people in 1948, when they sort of unceremoniously attacked my country, to about over 12 million people today. So that's a huge population growth in about 80 years. And everybody who lives in Jordan, imagine that, has a water footprint and needs to have water. So they have this problem. And in fact, here's a picture of a demonstration in the north of Jordan, which took place when all these Syrian refugees were coming in saying, look, we want to be hospitable, and they have a wonderful tradition, a Bedouin tradition of opening, but we need water. We don't have enough water as it is. And in the city of Amman, 8 hours a week, and I just was visiting Amman, and a former student of mine, she said, it's really true. If you don't fill up your cistern on your roof in the city of Amman, you're going to be basically, visiting your friend and asking for a cup of water. It's certainly not going to wash your clothes or anything like that. So all that provides a background for what's happened. I want to talk a little bit about the history, because one of the senses that I have as an old timer is that we had this opportunity, which I started with when there was a peace process. And at that time, we really thought in the environmental movement, this is our chance. We can take an environmental dividend from the peace process. If we can sort of get it all set up right, as people trying to rush forward to create reconciliation, maybe the environment can be a winner. And so in 1995, here you see a picture between the late Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, the late Yasser Arafat, former president of the Palestinian Authority, and thank heavens Bill Clinton's still alive and kicking. And the Oslo Accord had long and detailed water provisions. And I won't go into the details because it's not really a class today, but basically there's a joint water committee, which still actually operates to coordinate where can you drill wells and where should sewage treatment plants be, and all water issues. There's a recognition that Palestinians have some rights of water because there was a debate over the years, but that's to be negotiated in a permanent settlement. And they even allocated 118 million cubic meters per year, which you now know means, I guess, about 118 billion quarts of water a year. Did I get that right? Anyway. After that happened, something changed the face of the water reality in our region. And that's the ingenuity of the scientists, and I'm going to give a shout out to our rival university, Ben Gurion University, that really learned how to make the membranes in reverse osmosis phenomenally efficient. And all of a sudden, over the years, it had always been over $1 to make 1,000 liters of water, 1,000 quarts of water, and that was $1 when $1 meant something, not like today. All of a sudden, it was 50 cents, 60 cents, depending, what that is. And so Israel decided to double down on desalination. Because over the years, we were never sure if it was going to be a rainy year or a drought year. And when it was drought years, farmers paid a price, and people were very nervous, is there going to be enough water? And so we started going to, and that's like a world phenomenon. Today, we know that there are 21,000 operating desalination plants in the world, and it goes up as much as 10% a year on average, okay? So this is where the world's going, and don't worry about it. There's enough water in the ocean to provide humans with drinking water into any kind of future population scenario, okay? Even if we all have swimming pools. So talking about these issues, by the way, what I'm going to be saying, if you have problems with insomnia, there's several articles I've written about this, and you're all welcome to take a look at them. Now, the thing is that Israel, over the years, has been decreasing in its per capita usage, but our population is growing as well. So you can see that Israel's looking at that 253. Now, do you remember the Falcon, her per capita usage per day? You needed at least 1,000 cubic meters of water a day. And yet, in fact, Israelis have 200 plus, okay? So what's going on? How many of you have been to Israel here? We have a few hands here. Did you ever turn on the water and nothing came on? No, water goes very well. So somehow or other, maybe something interesting is happening in that regard, okay? And this is the story that we have this desalination plant, which now provides close to 90% of our household water. So this is a game changer for the region. So if I'm sort of wrapping up, how do I look at this environmentally? And this is sort of a final slide of a very long and tedious lecture which I make my students go through about desalination's environmental impacts. But if you sort of wrap it up, one of the first concerns was desalination plants are going to supplant the beautiful beaches on the Mediterranean in Israel, and Israel doesn't have space for them. But in fact, very, very clever planning has moved the desal plants either inland or embedded them in existing infrastructure for power plants or whatever, and we haven't lost a single centimeter of beach as far as I know. I have a very good friend and colleague who's in there who knows more about this stuff than me, David Katz, who's now at Duke, so he'll have to tell me if I fudge that. But I haven't seen a single beachfront lost because of desalination. So I think that's okay. The second concern when people are concerned about the sustainability of desalination is the discharges, because when you do desalination, you have a process called reverse osmosis, where you push the seawater with great energy through a membrane. And about 70% of the water goes through as pure H2O, and 30% is a somewhat salty brine. But one of the things you're worried about is that the membranes will get clogged up. And to stop that, you use something called antiscalants, which is a chemical which unclogs membranes. And so it's a great thing to have. And some people say, what happens there? But in fact, if we take a look at it, the chemicals inside the antiscalants are not toxic necessarily. And although 30% of the water, the brine, is sent back into the sea, usually a kilometer or two into the sea, there hasn't been any really serious indication that it's been disastrous, particularly in a sea like the Mediterranean, which is nutrient poor. I've even had some people argue that it's a boom for the fishes because all the phosphates and other nutrients that are in the antiscalants provide sort of a big all-you-can-eat buffet for the algae, and the fish do great. So there's no indication that the iron and the other things there are a problem. And the other benefit is, and this is maybe the one more relevant to this discussion, when I first got involved in this, there was an assumption that water was a zero-sum game. And if Israel got water, that means the Palestinians didn't have water. All of a sudden, and it created a hydrohysteria, like we're all going to be right. All of a sudden, we can make water very inexpensively. We don't have to be completely apoplectic about our water resources in the same way that we can make cement or other natural sources. We can make as much water as we want. So the downside of desalination is that it's a fairly high energy process. This is our Simon. Is he still a figure on music shows in America? Well, for those of us. And this is something which has become far more salient, unfortunately, in the last 2 years. It creates a vulnerability that when you have 5 or 6 major desalination plants providing 90% of your drinking water, I can show them to you on Google Earth right now, but wonderful people like Nasrallah and other enemies of Israel also could see them and in fact targeted them sometimes in wars. In fact, one of the great miracles of Israel's recent skirmish with Iran was that Iran didn't send any of their huge ballistic missiles to our desalination plant, because if they had, we'd all be scrambling to have some sort of well, we'd be like the Jordanians, we'd be in big trouble. So that also makes you very dependent on that. The other problem is more of a psychological problem. For those of us who've been preaching the gospel of sustainability to the Israeli public now for decades, all of a sudden, and telling them, we live on spaceship Earth, and there's limited resources we all have to save, all of a sudden, we can use as much water as we want. And I'll quote here research from Dr. Katz, who's here, who actually showed that there is this moral hazard problem, that since we started getting desalination, all these years of encouraging Israelis to conserve water, didn't lose it completely. We still consume less per person in a lot of countries, but people use more water than they used to use. But the energy, that's really the issue, and that's a problem, I think, water worldwide. But in Israel, just the desalination uses 4% of the energy in the system. But we need more water because we have our own version of the Aral Sea, which is the Dead Sea, which is getting smaller. And this is the projected what's going to happen if we continue it to shrink there. And so having this new resource allowed for new ideas and new opportunities in water negotiations in the region. This is a picture of the Palestinian Minister of Water, the Jordanian Minister of Water, and Sylvain Shalom was the head of Minister of Regional Cooperation. He's since backed off the political scene for complicated reasons. But they put together an agreement with the World Bank, which called for a new desalination plant to be created in Aqaba, okay, which would create 80 million cubic meters of water a year, or 80 billion liters. And half of the water would go to Israel and half would go to Jordan. The brine would go up to the Dead Sea and help fill that disappearing sea there, okay? So in the this was the picture that the Huffington Post used when they presented it. But you can see the desal plants here. It's delivered from Jordan to Israel. And in return for the half of the water that they're getting, Israel would give Jordan water from its Kinneret Lake and the Jordan River system, where they have more water than Jordan does in return. And that's where the Jordanians actually live, because very few people live in this area here. So that was the idea. The project hasn't happened yet, but it was a good idea. And it was only created during that time. And they also had this idea that the water would flow up through the Jordanian side, create hydroelectric power in the Dead Sea, and then the water would get pumped to Amman. So it was a really good project. The only problem was when they started, I think they thought it would cost $1 billion, then it was $2 billion, then it was $3 billion, and eventually they couldn't find somebody to write the check. Fast forward to the late 2010s, okay, 2018, 2019, 2020, when Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and King Abdullah were not getting along very, very well. So I already said that as part of the agreements that existed at Oslo, Israel agreed to transfer water. And one of the things that the water managers had said, we could give you probably 50 million cubic meters more of water. And that's a lot of water for Jordan, a lot of water. And they said, we'll even pay for it now, because in the past they were just getting it as part of the peace agreement. But Netanyahu was dissatisfied with some of the positions, and King Abdullah, they didn't seem to like each other very much. And so he decided to freeze that particular project and to basically turn off the faucet to the Jordanians. And that made the situation even better in terms of the relations, okay? Why am I bringing all this up? I'm bringing this up because what happened in 2021 should be a source of hope for all of us. A new government was elected. And this is the man on the right with the wonderful hairline. Naftali Bennett was the prime minister. And he came and he said, what can I do as a gesture to the Jordanians to get them back as good neighbors? They said, well, you know, we did stiff them with the 50 million cubic meters. He said, well, can we give it up? They said, sure, we won't affect us at all. So he immediately said, this is a headline from July 12th, 2021. He was made prime minister on June 13th. Within less than a month, he's already visiting Jordan because he said, have this 50 million cubic meters on me, okay? And King Abdullah, who had been extremely recalcitrant and not interested in any cooperation, said, you know, why don't you come over for coffee? And things started to move forward at that point. So you can see within a couple of months, we said, we'll double that again, okay? And we're actually trying to think about doing that. The Jordan River was never really deep and wide and chilly and cold, like they say, but it's an important resource, has enormous spiritual significance for Christians, and it's just a really nice ecosystem, I think. But parts of it looked like this. So there's a real need to restore the Jordan River. So this is an agreement that was actually signed in 2022 by the previous government between Israel and Jordan. This is our former Minister of Environment, Tamar Zandberg, talking about reducing pollution and returning that. And then we have a whole MOU to talk about how to do that. We're talking about this little area here. So also, I mentioned that organization EcoPeace here. They would bring in talking about civil society, getting the mayors in the area together at the local level to see what they can do to bring the Jordan River back to life, getting kids together. These are Israeli and Jordanians and Palestinians working together to restore the letters. So I want to just make the point here that when we go back to the beginning, I was talking about the debate between the Neo-Malthusians and the Cornucopians. It seems to me that, at least in the Middle East, the technological optimists have a good point here. We can make water, and that can make a real difference in terms of lubricating the kind of things we need to happen in the Middle East for peace. One of the things that has to happen is we have to start clogging the leaks. Israel, I think, is the world leader in this notion of monitoring how much water leaks out. And one of the great ironies, tragedies, if you can call it, in the Middle East is that so many of these cities in the Arab world who have such little water resources end up leaking out half of them, or 60% of them, 33% in average in Palestine. Bethlehem is 42%. It's hard to get up-to-date figures. So that's an issue which we started to think about working together. And then in the summer of 2022, I can't help but mention the optimism at the time, because one of the problems we had with desalination was that the Gaza Strip had no real serious infrastructure. And as somebody who spent a lot of time in Gaza when I was in reserve mostly duty, it was something you smelled wherever you went. But in 2022, with the help of Western nations, a meaningful, significant plant with secondary treatment was set forward. And for the first time, Gazan treatment was largely taken care of. And that meant that discharges into the Mediterranean stopped. And why is that important? Because the Gaza Strip is right next to Ashkelon, which was the first big desalination plant. Many days we had to close the desal plant because the water was so polluted that even the fantastic membranes developed over the years by Ben Gurion scientists were no longer effective. So all of a sudden, we looked like we're making real progress in that area too. So this is a time of hope, not so long ago, 2022, okay? So this is a very bad photograph of the desal plant from Ashkelon. And then we have a war, and I wrote an article with a woman who's the past director of the Ministry of Environment at the time about, and this was a year ago when this came out. Since that time, things have gotten much, much worse. But we know that Gaza is going to need, besides a tremendous amount of rebuilding of hospitals and houses, something like that, they're going to have to rebuild their environmental infrastructure, which was already in really bad shape in terms of the leakages and whatever. So this is one of the primary paramount objectives that we have there. And this is sort of what we did there. And then now we have a new government. And guess what? The extension of the water deal, well, it's in question. This is from 2024. It's not clear we're going to do that, okay? So I want to sort of wrap up the water point, and I'll say a few words about climate change maybe, and then we'll go to questions, by saying that I think that water is a huge potential for working together. We've seen it happening, but it requires both technological optimism, but it needs also political goodwill on all sides. And I'm hopeful, and I'll finish why I'm hopeful at the end for that reason. Israel is located in the Middle East, which is a climate hotspot. All of around the Mediterranean, it's a climate hotspot, which means that the problems that everybody is facing they're like on steroids. We have more temperatures rising, more droughts, more extreme rain events, and all these kind of things like that. So even so much so that already by 2021, we managed to get the Israeli security institutions concerned about it. We actually put out a book called Environment, Climate, and National Security, New Front for Israel. And when I was in Israel's parliament, the head of my party was the Minister of Defense, and we talked a lot about these issues, particularly this, because the region is getting really, really hot. I know you think North Carolina is a place that gets warm in the summertime, but that ain't nothing, okay? I mean, we're talking about places where the difference between life and death is having and air conditioning. Here on the streets of Baghdad, people will be taking showers, just like we used to when I was living on a kibbutz in the desert. We used to give the cows showers 5 times a day so they could kind of get by. That's literally what the situation is there. And we know there were situations there. In 2003, 1,500 people died in Paris from the heat wave. That's really very small. 40-degree heat compared to the 50-degree heat that was the emirate every single year. And in 2019, Israel crosses the 50-degree barrier, which is, I think, about 125 degrees, 127 degrees. It's very, very hot. Egypt, there was a case where there was a power shortage in the summer. High-rise building of elderly people could not climb the steps in that kind of heat, and they literally cooked to death as temperatures rose to 50 and 60 degrees, and they mass deaths. And then last year, we had the horrible situation of 1,300 people came on the Hajj to Saudi Arabia, the big pilgrimage that is maybe the pinnacle of the religious experience for Muslims. And some of them were so zealous to go to the Hajj that they didn't make hotel reservations. They said, we'll sleep on the side of the road. But when the temperature stays over 45 degrees all day long, you're going to die. And that's exactly what happened. So the heat is killing people in our region. And Israel is no different in that sense. In 1970, temperatures have gone up 2 degrees over and I should really give the temperatures in Fahrenheit, because it's so much more frightening when the numbers are twice as big. But the world average is when it's twice as much as there. The sea level rise is about 2 to 3 times what the world average is. So we are seeing these impacts very, very clearly. And I just decided to give you something from last week or something like this. Is The Guardian, so it's kind of reliable. 15th of August, a week ago, the hottest day in Israeli history. Temperatures did not go below 36 degrees, which is 97 degrees in Israel in Stone. You do not want to go outside to get a breath of cool evening air at 11 o'clock at night and be walking to a hairdryer. So that's really what it is. So we're looking at terrible things. And one of the things that's happening is we're facing massive forest fires. Okay, Israel, one of our, I think, most astonishing and symbolically significant contributions to a better environment in the future was the fact that Israelis were a little bit obsessed with planting trees. 97% of the natural vegetation and woodlands in Israel had been eliminated over the 2,000 years when there was different rulers taking over there after, and then when the Zionism brought Jews back to the land of Israel, returning the vegetation to the land of Israel was a really important thing. And so we've seen a tremendous, I think about the Jerusalem area, about 60% of the land is forested, which is huge considering there was no trees there at all. We know from aerial photographs 100 years ago. But now we have forest fires, which are happening. This is near my house in Mavo Modi'in. That was in 2019. They said, well, it's a 20-year, 30-year fire. Never. And then next year we had another massive fire. And then the Jerusalem hills burned. In 2023, the Knesset reported that basically we have 15% of our forests have burned, okay? And then this year on Holocaust Memorial Day, Israel had its hottest day in May in history. It was 98 degrees or something Fahrenheit, and we had our biggest forest fire in history. A week later, we had another hottest day in May, and we had a forest fire twice that size. So we are going to have a very, very different strategy for fire, addressing the problem of these kind of fires. That's the amount we had, because not only that, we've had a war. And when you have war, trees pay the price. We also have a problem with floods. Here's Tel Aviv's new normal. We have, particularly in the earlier part of the season, we have massive flooding in these areas. So, and I mentioned the heat waves already. Rainfall's falling. We can see here that the overall, this was the kind of numbers of Israel's water resources that I used to show, but now we know that they're much lower than they used to be because the general trends are that the water is dropping. So this past winter was the driest winter in the history of Israel, at least since we started recording rainfall about 100 years ago. So this is an opportunity. And one of the things that we're starting to do, when I started talking about climate change as an environmental activist, anybody who talked about adaptation and resilience, we were sort of looked at them askance because we said, defeatist, we're going to stop this thing, we're going to mitigate, we're going to reduce. But now we realize that climate change is not the gloomy projections of Al Gore, it is a new reality. And we have to prepare for that. We have to plant trees in cities and give people the thermal comfort that they deserve so they can walk around or whatever. So one of the interesting projects, and I think the most ambitious ones that we have, is this is a picture of the Sea of Galilee or the Lake Kinneret, where very significant place, certainly if you read the New Testament, and not only. So the levels have been dropping for a long time, and when they drop, the salinity in the lake goes up, and it's a source of drinking water and mostly agricultural water. In recent years, it's a problem. So in 2022, Israel started to move forward with its reverse water carrier. Now, the national water carrier was Israel's sort of signature infrastructure initiative during its first 20 years. We had a very sort of Stalinistic approach to this. We're going to really invest in massive projects and take water from the rich hydrologic use where the Galilee, where rainfall falls a lot, and bring it through a national carrier down to the south. So everybody in Israel can pay more or less the same price for water to have access to water. And it was, I think, 60% of the infrastructure budget at the time, and it kind of worked, okay? But it's an old system now, and the rainfall in the Galilee has dropped. And so for several years, they stopped pumping water out of the Galilee. And this gentleman, his name is Yuval Steinitz, and I'm not accustomed to saying nice thing about Likud politicians because I would like very much for Likud not to be in power anymore. But he did something which was fairly remarkable when he was Minister of Energy and Water, which he said was, we need to have a new way of managing water. No longer the sort of hydrological socialism where you take water from the areas in the north where it's a lot of rain and bring it to the south, similar to California if you've ever looked at their system. But we actually need to take water from the sea and replenish the Sea of Galilee and return it to its status as a national reservoir. And he started to do that. And looking at this is sort of when they were building the system here. And for the first time, it happened. His water shall fill from the seas and rivers dry up and parched. But no, we're going to stop that. And this is a photograph from the pilot release of waters. Unfortunately, or fortunately, if you want, immediately after they did this, we had 3 very, very rainy winters. And so they said, well, we're not going to run this system now. It's very expensive. But like I said, we just had a tremendously dry winter. And this fall, this system should go on. We're going to take water from the Mediterranean, desalinize it, it's the leftover water from the desalination, and send it to the Sea of Galilee. We can use the existing water infrastructure, send some of it to Jordan in times of need. And if Jesus does indeed come back and needs to walk on the water, he'll be walking on Mediterranean seawater. May not be natural, but at least it'll be wet. So that's something there. And I do want to say that we all need to do more for mitigation to reduce our emissions. Israel has not been what I would say a significantly conscientious nation. We need to do much, much more. The US also needs to do much, much more to reduce its carbon footprint. And we can see here that although per capita emissions have dropped in Israel, the population has grown. So for the most part, our emissions are going up and up and up. And you can see the sectors is like any other country, we have to do that. One of the ways we could do that is by empowering the Palestinians to have more renewable energy. When I was in the Knesset, I put a lot of time into trying to create opportunities for Palestinian entrepreneurs who wanted to create new energy systems to have solar farms in what's called Area C, sort of the more rural areas that Israel's in charge of in terms of administratively and security-wise, but it's a Palestinian area. And I had the blessings of the defense minister at the time, and we started to make progress, and then the government fell. But that's something that could absolutely happen. A very important project which was emerged and is called Project Prosperity now. But I remember when it was a sort of crazy idea that this organization called EcoPeace put forward. And in fact, I think David did the original economics on that project. So basically, this is the notion that Israel and Jordan have sort of flip sides of different resource scarcity problems. Jordan doesn't have water, but Israel doesn't have land. And if you want to have clean energy, you need lots of land. So why don't we take Jordanian arid deserts, put solar farms there, have them send clean electricity to Israel. Israel will take water, send it over to Jordan. Win, 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 okay? It's a leap of faith because that means that a critical resource for Israel energy would be coming from a neighbor. But maybe that's what we need to start doing in our region to get past this. And so this was sort of the MOU that was signed to make it happen. Unfortunately, that sort of fell apart. I have a lot to say about biodiversity, but I'm going to let it go because I just want to get some time for questions. But I do want to say this. These are very tough times in the Middle East. I don't think anybody in Israel is indifferent to certainly the fact that we have hostages who are still underground, suffering, starving, and enormous suffering and deprivation amongst the Gaza population. But I like to hope that this chapter will end and things will be better. And there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, we all talk about October 7th as a terrible day, and it was the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. It's also probably the worst day for Palestinian national aspirations. But on October 21st, the Arab nations convened in Cairo, okay? And the more radical anti-Israel organizations demanded a return to what we used to call the 3 no's: no negotiations, no recognitions, cancel all the embassies, because several of the countries through the Abraham Accords and previous have relations with Israel. And the moderate countries said, no, we're not going back. The realpolitik explanation could be, we may not love Israel, but we hate Iran even more. Whatever the reason was, notwithstanding the heartbreaking images and the discomfort in the Arab world with what's going on in Gaza, none of these countries have recalled their ambassadors, canceled Israel's relations, okay? And so to me, this means hope. And for the first time now, one of the things that you may not recognize, but pretty much all sides of the political spectrum are talking about the day after in Gaza being a multinational Arab force of moderate countries, okay? The kind of integration that we've always sort of dreamed of, okay? And for me, once Hamas and the extremist jihadist ideology, which represents, does indeed leave the stage, we can open it up for the moderate countries. And when you bring in the moderate countries, they provide also a model for the Palestinians. You know, maybe rather than being a radical Islamic, you know, a fundamentalist country, you could go the way of United Arab Emirates or even a Saudi Arabia, which is getting a little more liberal. That might be a better way forward. And when that happens, and I think it'll happen sooner than we know, the environment is going to need a lot of work. And I believe that we have a history which suggests the possibility, and although the pendulum has swung maybe not in a very good direction for the last 2 years, I believe it will swing back and we can do much better. So thank you very much for that, and I'm happy to take any and all questions, arguments, discussions. Bring it on. Thank you very much. Yes, please. Just introduce yourself when you're...
When you talked about the environmental challenges, you said water scarcity, climate change, biodiversity. You didn't mention any issues of pollution. And I know the work that I've done with the Israeli Ministry of Health, there are major problems in health of the population. And of course, whatever is happening in Israel is worse in the Palestinian areas and the surrounding things. And I was just wondering about your thoughts there.
Well, the first thing is you know, as you see, I didn't even get to biodiversity. So if I'd really wanted to give you the full spectrum of Israel's environmental woes, we could be here till midnight and we'd just be getting onto number 7 or 8 on the list. There's a lot of things. I didn't talk about plastic in the ocean, and there's a whole lot of stuff. It is true that Israel has, in many ways, many of the pollution profiles of the West. One of the things when I was in the Knesset I was very involved in was pushing the government to create a standard for PFAS chemicals, which are these forever chemicals. And we had hearings about it, and the Ministry of Environment was just, oh, they were just pitiful. They were full of excuses and that, and I browbeat them. And when I left the Knesset, I got a phone call from the organization that I once founded. We're suing the Ministry of Environment and using their testimony in your committee to win in the Supreme Court an administrative. Could you be the number 2 appellant after us? And I said, my pleasure. And we won that case. And the first regulations are happening. So I would like to hope that to some extent Israel's progress is linked to that of Europe. Way back in the day when I was getting started, there was a huge debate in Israel about lead in gasoline. This would be something the younger generation might find it unimaginable, but you know, lead, which is a terrible neurological toxin, which makes children lose, become mentally deficient very quickly, was in gasoline. And so we were fighting to get lead out of gasoline in Israel because that was what they had done in the US. And the Ministry of Transportation said, but no, we import most of our vehicles from Europe. And the EU was very, very tenuous or cautious and had not yet really moved forward in phasing out fuel. So in many areas, certainly in mobile source pollution, we kind of link ourselves to Europe. Fast forward, you know, when you look at what's happening to American regulation and I don't have adjectives to describe how, as somebody who worked in graduate school at the EPA, the tragedy and the loss of both the expertise, but dismantling of the American system. Thank God we're linked to the European system, and we many areas adopt European standards. That doesn't mean we always enforce them the way we should, but on the whole, if you look at trends, Israel's water tends to be generally cleaner than it was, certainly air in the cities. We're not like Norway, which is now 100% sales of renewables, but last year 22% of the cars were electric, and I think we'll continue to move in that direction. So we have a problem with pollution. If you want to ask about something specific, I can try to invent a question, but we have much work to do in that area like everybody else.
We hear about the challenges that Iran is facing with water, and I was wondering if you can elaborate on our cooperation with them, future potential.
Well, there was a time, it's unimaginable. I'll tell a story about where we might be, okay? Because Israel has a program of releasing species that had once been flourished in the land of Israel and became extinct. It's called the Chaybar program. And I think the second, I have a slide actually to show. The first one was we released with the wild asses. But the second species released is called a fallow deer. Now, fallow deer had become, last time we see fallow deer, it's called yachmor, if you know the Hebrew word for it, was during the Crusader times. We know that there was some around, and they probably got hunted into extinction then. And they only found one serious herd of this deer left, and it was in Iran. Now, I'm talking here back when the Shah of Iran was running, and Israel was pretty, they were a non-Arab country, we're a non-Arab country. Of course we got along great. Why not? And so it turned out that there was this herd, and against all odds, the ranger for the National Park Service of Iran, who was responsible for protecting that herd, was Jewish. How many Jewish boys became park rangers in America? Not so many. In Iran, even fewer, but we got the one. So the last flight of El Al that flew out of Tehran to Israel before the Islamic Revolution didn't have people in it. It had fallow deer in it, okay? And they took them and they brought them to the Chaybar in the Carmel near Haifa in the north of Israel. And slowly but surely, this very shy and beautiful animal became more numerous, and they released them up in Nachal Kziv, in the Kziv Valley in the north, in the Galilee, and then some in the Jerusalem hills. And I can tell you that one of the most thrilling moments of my life, well, that maybe it's going a little far. Getting married was pretty important too, but this was really big one, was one morning I went up, when I was actually in the Knesset, I was going to meet with some disgruntled people who were complaining about pollution. I got there at 6 in the morning. It was too early to see them. So I was driving through this park and I saw fallow deer just wandering around, and it was like a sign that yes, we can do better. And we did that because of Iran's cooperation. So there's no reason why Iran couldn't benefit from the remarkable Israeli water technology. And I think that Benjamin Netanyahu made a fairly cynical video to that end, telling me, see, if you were friends with us, we could share all of our tricks about wastewater reuse and all this stuff. But so let's hope that we could do that one day. I think the question.
A quick question. Reverse osmosis commercially has been used for 65 years in Middle East. With some impact, as you are describing. The new technology which came out within the last maybe 20, 25 years has a potential to be much more effective, and that's a recycle, what is cutely called post-consumption water. You did not mention it. Is there any effort in Middle East on that area?
So I spent the last couple years spending half my time at Stanford teaching, and I found one of the questions I had is, how is it that there's no desalination practice, one plant really in all of California, and yet they're always suffering from water? And I finally became friends with a woman who used to be the chief water commissioner for California, and she said, oh, because we have to take sewage, and that's a much more cost-effective way of doing it. Now, there were a lot of reasons why that's not happening worldwide. One of them is psychological. How many of you would feel comfortable drinking water that only a few days earlier had come out of somebody's toilet? There's the ick factor. But there is examples. I know Redwood City has everybody's recycling it for irrigation. That's not a question. But he was saying about, why are you doing desalination when you could be using recycled sewage? And that's exactly what the people in California have said. So when I see California having massive sewage recycling, and I will say maybe Israel should consider it too. But in the meanwhile, desalination seems like it's working and it's available, and 22,000 plants can't be wrong. Maybe they are wrong, but I'm actually working on an article to explain the psychological difference in California, why they reached a totally different conclusion when they faced their water shortages. I have a question on the side here. No, that debate was resolved years ago. That's very important. Yes, sir.
Quick questions. First, in terms of the sort of the element of conflict around water, it feels like a long time ago, but a few months ago when there was the India-Pakistan conflict, there was the suspension of the Indus Water Treaty. And to the best of my knowledge, that's not come back. And I'm sure no one in Kashmir or in Pakistan is happy about that. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on sort of if that's a sort of new frontier in terms of using water as a sort of tool of war.
So hold on to the second question. I'll answer that, and because I'm just
Okay. Okay.
you know, I've passed the time when I can handle two questions at once, but we'll go right back to the second. So one of the traumas, I think, for me is that there's always been this sort of axiomatic line that the thing about water agreements is that they are robust, that even when the countries are shooting at each other, they somehow recognize that water agreements are humanitarian nature and everybody complies. And the proof positive was the Indus River Treaty, where Pakistan and India are not the best of friends, and yet they reach this agreement of how to divide the water, and then Modi goes and cancels it unilaterally. So it sort of was disproved the proof positive, and I think it is a very, very bad precedent. And we have, the United States has a president who's very, very proud of stopping 7 conflicts. It would be really great if he could pick up the phone to his pal Modi and say, you should be adopting that treaty. I think it's very important for stability in that region, especially with all their anticipated problems with the snow melt in the Himalayas and stuff like that. Second question.
Yes, thank you. And I was thinking sort of on that, right, where, you know, sort of really arbitrary decisions by reactionary governments are having these huge effects. What do you think sort of is the responsibility or sort of the opportunity that, like, I think the Guardian called it, right, the climate majority can do when sort of governments are really pushing back against these initiatives that are both broadly popular and sort of necessary for these communities to survive?
It's funny you mention, I've taught the last 3 years in California climate policy, and I teach a course in Israel as well and on that topic. And I remember 2 years ago, I said, or a year and a half ago, I said, you know, everything we did in this course about all these incredibly successful initiatives, I cherry-picked the most effective policies, but it could be public procurement, which sends certain things forward, and there's all kinds of ways to encourage innovation. I said, but this all sort of is hanging in the balance. And then November 2024 happened, and things went south. So teaching the course this year, which I taught in the spring quarter at Stanford, was very, very different and more discouraging. So first of all, the easy answer is, well, it's up to the states. Usually in the past, when there was a administration that was less than enthusiastic about environmental regulations, many states and cities step forward. There's limits to what the local level can do, and it's necessary, but there are indications they are. I also am hopeful that some of the technologies, there was an article in The Economist 2 days ago, which I would recommend, talking about how so many developing countries are starting to ban fossil fuel vehicles altogether because we've crossed a tipping point in terms of the cost effectiveness of at least renewable energies and electric vehicles. But that's not really solving the problem. The only good news I can tell you, first of all, in the destruction of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was such an important piece of legislation, they left certain little pieces behind, and one of them is carbon removal. Now, why is that? I have an explanation, I think. So I took my students to a factory in Tracy, California, by a company called Heirloom Carbon. And they are the first industrial size removal center where they use limestone to, some real smart scientists at Berkeley figured out how to speed up the process of sequestration, and they burn it off. Anyway, and they said, oh, but this is a teeny pilot plant. I thought it was a ginormous. I said, no, we're going to make 2 plants that are twice as big. I said, yeah, good luck. With this government. This was like in March of this year. They said, no. They're located in Louisiana, in the district of the Speaker of the House. And we think that he's going to continue funding through and indeed that's what it was when they had the big, beautiful, disastrous bill for the American economy. That survived, which is crazy. There's also a more cynical, maybe more precise explanation, which is fossil fuel companies love carbon removal because they can claim, you see, if we could just remove the carbon, we can keep burning fossil fuels and making all the money that we make. And I don't believe that to be a case either. Anyway, there's a lot of things that people can do. Even so, 31% of our emissions come from the food system. So that's something everybody can do. Eat less meat. Why is it that we go into Burger King and the Impossible Whopper costs more than the beef Whopper? That seems to me lunacy. That's a perverse subsidy to my mind. There's a lot of things that could be happening, but there's midterms coming up. You can do a lot of work, and that's the best thing you can do for climate policy.
You were talking about the recent forest fires in Israel and Jerusalem, but there have been forest fires in southern Syria as well, in Latakia. Do you think there is an avenue for cooperation with the new regime there, or is it still too weak and uncertain having a former Nusra Front leader in charge?
So that is a great question, and it's one that if we're sort of heading towards the end, we can sort of end on an optimistic kind of note. So first of all, the verdict or the jury is still out on what's going to be with this Syrian regime. I have a very close friend who is Druze and is extremely skeptical, and that's putting it modestly, about the intentions of the new. But on the other hand, I don't ever recall a time when an Israeli minister, in this case Ron Dermer, meets with the foreign minister of Syria to discuss a humanitarian corridor which could reach the Druze area. And if you take him at his word, he's not talking about, a war with Israel. And Israel's very, very nervous about it. But quite frankly, most of his military hardware that he could use to kill us, we took out within a week, which in retrospect is not a bad thing, because I'm not sure that would be put to good use. But this is, I think, a potential. And surely the good news is when we had forest fires, for example, the Big Carmel fire, the Palestinian Authority sent their firefighters over there. Well, there is sometimes a sense, it's almost like the Bible, which talks about, this notion of Baal Tashchit, that you're not allowed to destroy fruit trees in times of war, that maybe trees should be off limits, that our war is not their war, and we can leave them aside. And so surely cooperating to protect the trees that we all need for all kinds of reasons would be important. I think it's early. I don't have a really informed answer. I wrote actually an op-ed which I decided not to publish about when the Druze were being slaughtered, about how we should be very suspicious of this leader, and said, don't be so defeatist. Give him a chance. We'll see.
You mentioned briefly one of the ministers in the Likud, and I'm just wondering, in the search for shared values across the political spectrum, are there opportunities in the Haredi population or Likud to find common ground in environmental issues?
I'm getting fantastic questions because they let me continue to spout the optimistic environmental evangel. Look, when I was in the Knesset, I won a prize for being the most bipartisan one, and I'm not such a bipartisan kind of guy, but I work in the environment, and thank heavens the tragic polarization that has taken place in the US over the last 20 years, where all of a sudden Democrats are sort of pro-environmental and Republicans are less so, we'll say, that has not come to Israel. If you ask me objectively, the very best minister of environment was a guy named Gilad Ardani, was the UN ambassador. He's a Likud minister. He was fantastic, okay? And regarding the ultra-Orthodox population, well, they just resign and hope they stay out of the government. But the ultra-Orthodox parties put as the head of the Interior and Environment Committee a guy named Yaakov Asher, the past mayor of Bnei Brak, which is an ultra-Orthodox city. And there was a provision in the coalition agreement to have a climate law. Now, this is the second time a coalition agreement called for it, but he really took it seriously. And I went to all of those hearings. And for some reason, he and I get along very, very well. And his attention to detail and attempts to really bring it, in the end, he threw up a white flag because Israel's finance ministry sort of made it impossible to make an agreement with the Ministry of Environment. But here he was, an ultra-Orthodox, a very large man, pushing these two government ministries together. It was a beautiful thing to watch. And so I really think that we have not fallen into that really, really terrible dynamic of, some politicians are everybody's in favoring the environment. It would be unimaginable, I think, in Israel that anybody would talk about, and then we don't have climate denial in any meaningful way at all. A couple of professors, one of them may still be a candidate to become the provost of Hebrew University. Boo. So we all, I think 2,000 academics signed a petition. No, because we just don't want to open up that can of worms in Israel. He's a smart physicist. He just got it wrong. But so I think that Israel, in that sense, politically, is a much more hopeful place than we have here. I don't feel like my biggest partner in environmental matters was a woman named Gila Gamliel, a Likud former minister of environment. And, you know, we didn't talk about the West Bank much, but we got along about everything else. So there is much to be done, and we can do it together.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, thank you so much. So more of a personal question. How do you reconcile being an environmental advocate or activist in these times when traditionally it's a more of like a left-leaning space surrounded by, you know, traditional civil rights, social justice movement, with the recent, you know, changes within the very far left within those circles? How are you navigating? How are you experiencing that?
Well, you know, after your heart gets broken, you sort of get back on the saddle. That'd be the short answer. I'll tell you a story to sort of make this. When it was highly unusual for me to be appointed chair of a subcommittee, was the subcommittee of the health committee, by a member of a rival party. The dynamics in the Knesset are there's committees, and a committee chair will throw a bone to one of the members of their own party so they can sort of get good press, whatever. But to give it to rival parties, almost never done. And there was a woman from a right-wing party named Edith Silman, who was the chair of and I kept nudging her. I said, Edith, when you were in the army, you were a guide for the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel. You're an environmentalist. Why don't you let me run a subcommittee? And she was being evasive. And this is already 3 months into my term there. And one day I kind of cornered her, and she said, okay, but here's why I'm going to do it. I said, well, I'd like to know why. She said, well, you know, I have a 14-year-old son, and she's an Orthodox Jewish woman with a head covering, everything like that. She said, I have a 14-year-old son, and he actually has a poster in his bedroom of a woman on the wall. I said, Edith, that's unheard of, but scandal. She said, no, I let him do it because that's a picture of Greta Thunberg. Well, I don't think he's got a picture of Greta Thunberg there anymore after her recent flotilla to Gaza. And I think it's really unfortunate because I used to assign Greta Thunberg essays to my students. I ain't doing that anymore. But the truth of the matter is that I try, you know, within certain constraints, to respect everybody's ability to say, to criticize Israel's. I have a lot of criticism about the way the war has been run. Certainly very different than some of the fake news and I think false narratives that are put forward. But at the end of the day, we only have one planet, and you can't pick your allies always. And so I think Israeli environmentalists who genuinely had been, I think sometimes ostracized by certain, I have a close colleague at the Technion who'd been running a long-term ecological research network and was politely asked by his colleagues after we love you personally, but we just can't work with you anymore. So there's been I think a loss, but I'd like to believe that that's temporary and that when we finally do move forward. And so I'm going to kind of wrap it up with the final thing. That's why I can be optimistic, because I started to say that on the 21st of October, the Arab world spoke. And this is the first time that we face our regional challenges with a potential to really integrate ourselves into the region, to be part of that. And that's a new opportunity. And when I hear even Netanyahu saying, yes, eventually there'll be an Egyptian-led multi-governmental force there, I think, wow, that's a sea change. And I don't think we have a choice. And I'm also optimistic because I think as this climate crisis becomes more and more severe, people are going to realize we just don't have the time for rejectionists on either side. We don't have the time for Houthis who just want to kill people. We need to save Yemen from a climate disaster. And all these countries are facing this kind of thing. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to, the forces of moderation and sanity and sustainability will be able to close ranks together and make our region a better place. And it's certainly a place worth saving. Thank you very, very much.